My name is Melissa Lewis. I live in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation and I work at University of Missouri School of Medicine. So this presentation, the first time I did something similar was a few years back, and Donnie Saloli asked me, can you do a presentation about Cherokee foods? And I said, sure. And then when I introduced myself, I said, so this is my first time doing a presentation. And she looked at me sort of like, oh, uh-oh. So the disclaimer is that I do not have a degree in Cherokee foods or plants or anything in that field. And I don't have decades of experience of cooking Cherokee foods. I just am someone who is very interested in plants and very interested in learning about our Cherokee foodways. So I'm here today just to share what I know with you, and maybe we'll go ahead and play about a 40-minute pre-recorded presentation so you can not have to hear toddler noises in the background. And maybe the last 10 minutes or so, we can have a discussion and maybe we can learn from each other a little bit more about some of these topics. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop here and give it to back to Kevin to share the video of my presentation today. I thought it might be a good idea to just think about some of your favorite traditional Indigenous foods or traditional Cherokee foods. So go ahead and in the chat, put some foods or plants or even plant medicines that you really like. And while you do that, I'll go through a few of my favorites. Here is my summer crop, some corn, some squash, and some beans wrapped around my corn up there. Kanaji, hickory nuts, chinkapin nuts, and persimmons. I'm thinking right now, most persimmons are looking like the picture on the right, a little bit green. Here's some bread I like to make out of persimmons. It's a little bit of hard work, but sure love persimmons. Here's a picture of some bean bread, another delicious Cherokee food with some hickory leaves wrapped around it. Wild onions and eggs, sagi inige ehi ale juej. Wishi. And some edible flowers. Red bud and black locust are some of my favorites. And teas, cedar and strawberry, some of my favorite teas. So I'll have to take a look at what you all put in the chat, but hopefully that got us going on the right foot. So I'd like to start out by broadly talking about traditional Indigenous food systems. So about 80% of the food that's eaten around the world today has been cultivated by Indigenous people of the Americas. Another interesting fact is that Indigenous pre-colonial diet had about 300 different kinds of foods each year, and the American diet now has a variety of about 12 to 30 different foods. Something else I wanted to point out is that there are myths about Indigenous foodways, especially around our history. Indigenous people have designed some of the most advanced and sustainable farming and foodway techniques. Colonizers did not arrive to virgin forests, and in fact, Indigenous people interacted with the forests through caretaking and not just harvesting. So there has been a disruption in Indigenous food systems and traditional life ways. And we now have a significantly different diet and exercise patterns compared to pre-colonial life. And that's to a variety of reasons, and I'll share a few here. Forced relocation. Indigenous people have food systems and food ways that are tied to the places that they're their tribes are born from and have evolved with. Another disruption is the introduction of European plants and animals. Environmental degradation that prohibits people from, hunting or fishing or even growing certain foods due to maybe pollution in the water, the soil, the air even. Forced European farming methods and the prohibition of traditional ecological methods and beliefs. And again, thinking a little bit globally, some current issues in our food system include that about 75% of the world's plant genetic diversity has been lost. And that relates to a decline in the nutritional quality of Americans and Native Americans' diets, which is related to a growing epidemic of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. In addition to losing the plant genetic diversity and the nutritional quality of our diets, things like our traditional food ways, culinary skills, ecological farming practices, and entire cultures are at risk of being lost. Another important fact is that Indigenous people comprise about less than 5% of the world's population, but Indigenous people protect about 80% of the global biodiversity. Other global food systems challenge include that around 70% of our country's food supplies is made up of foreign crops. In addition, we lose about 40% of our food from farm to our tables to landfills. And finally, by 2050, the world demand for food is expected to increase by about 60%. So traditional Indigenous foods are one of the components that are at the heart of Indigenous cultures and life ways. And this article kind of demonstrated that. So both traditional food as well as traditional physical activity are associated with people's greater tribal self-identification, speaking a native language at home, using traditional remedies, and participating in or attending traditional events. And taking that one step further, research has shown that Native people that strongly and positively identify with their culture and participate in traditional cultural activities are more likely to have improved academic performance, improved positive mental health, reduced substance use, and improved physical health. Kind of going back to life ways, other specific kind of Indigenous specific challenges around the disruption of food systems. One is that historically prohibited traditional foods may have and continue to protect Indigenous people from diseases like metabolic disease. Within Cherokee Nation, the last time I looked at the statistics, it said that heart disease is the #1 killer of Cherokees starting in the age group of 30s and going on. So the foods that can protect from heart disease are very important. I know during my training, people pointed out that the Tohono O'odham had the highest rate of diabetes in the world. And interestingly enough, traditional Tohono O'odham beans called tepary beans have some of the most the strongest blood glucose lowering properties. And this is a traditional food that has very recently in our generations been revitalized and is now being grown again. Other foods include salmon, things with high omega-3s for the Coast Salish folks, for the Yupik folks, and foods like Jerusalem artichoke, hickory nuts, and persimmons for Cherokees. One study even demonstrated that persimmons have beta blockers, which is very impressive. Many tribes have remedies and ceremonies to treat diabetes, heart disease, or other cardiometabolic conditions that include hawthorn or sumac leaves, for example. But traditional medicine has been negatively affected by colonization and really has only become legal after 1978. But these practices around traditional medicine still carry stigma today. And due to the carryover effects of these policies, traditional medicine isn't used as much as it used to be. So we can move into Cherokee plants, and back in the spring were these elderberry flowers, and now they're ripened up and they're nice and juicy and ready to be picked and foraged. One of my favorite plants. So we can't talk about Cherokee plants and foodways without talking about corn. So Cherokee women are incredible farmers and have contributed to the indigenous movement of corn domestication, which you can see in the image at the bottom left. Corn is native to the Americas and is around 10,000 years old. And the importance of corn, or selu, cannot be understated. It is also the first Cherokee woman. Cherokee women pound corn into cornmeal using a canon, an example in the upper right corner, usually a log made out of oak or a hickory. And a really interesting piece of research found that pre-removal, so around 1820s, 1830s, around 89% of Cherokees grew corn on their homes, on their own individual property. And 100% of all communal Cherokee farms that were called gadugi grew corn crops. So I think it is safe to say this is one of the most important crops for Cherokees. So in addition to the corn crops, are partnered with the Cherokee farming techniques, and they are different than Western farming techniques. And in the bottom left corner, you'll see the Gadua Mound near Bryson City, near Cherokee, North Carolina, which is the Cherokee mother town. I'm sure some of you have been to or know about. So if you go there, elders talk about that all of our relatives are buried there. And I think it's safe to say that our corn relatives are also buried there and continue to be grown there. And I think it's important to note that Cherokees really have specific farming techniques that look different from the Western farming techniques that we know today. It's also challenging to talk about Cherokee food systems without talking about the chestnut. And again, thinking about the relationships that Cherokees have had with the land and the food and the plants in their ecosystem, this is an example of a very close relationship. Cherokee used this tree for many purposes, one of them being food. And also, Cherokees had a relationship with the chestnut tree and chestnut forests that had spiritual purpose, and it had ecological forest management purposes. When you think about the Cherokee New Year in the fall and the controlled burns and management of this area, again, this had kind of a spiritual purpose, a food purpose, to cook those chestnuts. And, another purpose was for forest management. And it's interesting to think about this almost symbiotic relationship that Cherokees had with the chestnut tree, and the removal of Cherokee people in the 1830s, and the chestnut blight happening at very similar times. So I want to share with you the Cherokee origin story of plant medicine. which is also called The Origin of Disease in Medicine, which you can find in James Mooney's book that's here to the left, that I won't get into. Some people, have some critiques of this book. But I do want to share the story with you because I think it really sets the tone for Cherokee values, expectations, and thinking about how we should live our lives. So I'll just do a couple of excerpts from the story, and feel free to read it on your own. The very first paragraph starts like this. In the old day, the beasts, birds, fishes, insects, and plants could all talk, and they and the people lived together in peace and friendship. But as time went on, the people increased so rapidly that their settlement spread over the whole earth, and the poor animals found themselves beginning to be cramped for room. This was bad enough, but to make it worse, humans invented bows, knives, blowguns, spears, and hooks, and began to slaughter the large animals, birds, and fishes for their flesh of their skins, for the flesh or their skins, while the smaller creatures, such as frogs and worms, were crushed and trodden upon without thought, out of pure carelessness or contempt. So the animals resolved to consult upon measures for their common safety. So the next part of the story is about how each group of animals got together in a council, which is a traditional Cherokee political structure, to try to discuss this problem and what they were going to do about it. I want to share with you just one of those animal councils, the Deer Council, and what they decided to do. The deer next held a council under the chief, the little deer, and after some talk decided to send rheumatism to every hunter who should kill one of them unless they took care to ask their pardon for the offense. They sent notice of their decision to the nearest settlement of Indians and told them at the same time what to do when necessity forced them to kill one of their deer tribe. Now, whenever the hunter shoots a deer, the little deer, who is swift as the wind and cannot be wounded, runs quickly up to the spot, and bending over the bloodstains, asks the spirit of the deer if it had heard the prayer of the hunter for pardon. If the reply be yes, all is well, and the little deer goes on their way. But if the reply is no, they follow on the trail of the hunter, guided by the drops of blood on the ground, until they arrive at the cabin in the settlement, when the little deer enters invisibly and strikes the hunter with rheumatism, so that he becomes at once a helpless cripple. So again, the councils go on, and many decide to send different disease from each animal, so that there are many, many diseases that are given to humans when they didn't exist. Now, I will say, if you remember in the story, one group of animals, and it was the ground squirrel, was the one that said, maybe we shouldn't do this to humans, but that was the only animal. And then finally, the very last paragraph of the story. When the plants who were friendly to human heard what had been done by the animals, they determined to defeat the latter's evil designs. Each tree, shrub, and herb, down even to the grasses and mosses, agreed to furnish a cure for someone of the disease named, and each said, I shall appear to help humans when they call upon me in their need. Thus came medicine, and the plants, every one of which has its use if we only knew it, furnish the remedy to counteract the evil wrought by the revengeful animals. Even weeds were made for some good purpose, which we must find out for ourselves. When the doctor does not know what medicine to use for a sick person, the spirit of the plant will tell them. So there are lots of implications of this story today, values and morals. And I'll talk about just a few of my reflections and reflections that I've heard other Cherokees talk about. So the first is that despite the fact that we have this story and it's telling us about what we should do in the future and how we should act, we continue to degrade the earth and its inhabitants. And there's quite a bit of evidence showing that we're very much in a danger zone. So one example is an article I have up here, a study by the United Nations, um, saying first warned that humans were fueling a dangerous greenhouse effect, and that if the world didn't act deliberately and collectively to slow the Earth's warming, there will be profound consequences for people and nature alike. The second is that, there were some directions about Cherokee protocol, and that we continue to not follow traditional Cherokee protocol around foodways. One example they give us is with the deer and the protocol that we should be asking for permission and pardon. And if we don't, then there are consequences that animals give us disease for our bad behavior. And some people say that we're repeating this behavior. The story is being repeated today. It seems that the World Health Organization has agreed that COVID-19 does have origins in bats, possibly some other animals as well, although there is some debate around if it was transmitted to humans in a market or possibly in a lab. So that is still, it seems to be being researched. And finally, despite our bad behavior, plants are the ones that came to our rescue. We didn't deserve it, but they decided to come anyways. And I think what's been interesting is watching the research around tobacco, a very important medicine plant for Cherokees, and also its relationship for the COVID-19 vaccine and treatment, for example. So maybe a little bit later, we can talk about, for folks in the audience, any other things that you see in that story, or any other morals or implications that you've gleaned from this particular story. So I would like to shift into Indigenous and Cherokee foods and food ways. There is a lot of evidence that Indigenous foods are good for our health, our mental health, and our physical health. Some things that are important to note that I listed down here is the seasonality. We'll talk a little bit about this, but that foods arrive and are gifted to us. The plants give us gifts right when we need them in different seasons. We've talked a little bit already about the importance of the variety of different plants, and that really relates to nutrition. Also, Indigenous foodways relate to exercise, and exercise is very important for our health and well-being. So going foraging, having a garden requires us to get out there and get some exercise. And finally, Indigenous foodways are rooted quite a bit of the time in community and provide a critical social support that we all need. I know my uncles have done a fish camp for many, many decades, and they get together and they get fish and they provide it to the family and the community. I wanted to start off with a traditional Cherokee food model that was created by the late Arlo Starr. He headed a project that put this food model together, and I just wanted to note some things that you might already see right away. One is the use of the Cherokee language and the syllabary. Two is the seasonality, and you'll see different solstice and equinox marking important times in the Cherokee seasonal calendar. And finally, the different colors denote if things were done individually, like hunting, if they're farmed foods, if it was agriculture, or fishing or gigging. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the role of our diet and mental health. A lot of people are struggling with mental health right now in the midst of a pandemic. there have been lots of challenges. I won't get into that, but Indigenous people and Cherokees do suffer from things like anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts at much higher rates than the average population. So we'll talk about diet and its role. So you might have heard some of these words before: the neurotransmitters serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. These are critical in maintaining positive mental health, and antidepressants, for example, target some of these areas. Micronutrients are necessary for these neurotransmitters to work the way they're supposed to. And for, in particular, vitamin B, D, magnesium, and omega-3s. Now, consequently, we have a huge micronutrient deficiency in the United States population. And the items that are highlighted in red represent the ones that we just talked about, the ones that really relate to mental health. And so you can see that for each one, it is the percentage of population that is deficient in each one of those in the United States. So 10% deficient in vitamin B, 52% of the US population deficient in magnesium, 94% deficient in vitamin D, and 100% deficient in omega-3s. And I can show you the data linking these micronutrients and mental health and health for each, but for the sake of time, I'll just use one as an example, and that would be our omega-3s. So omega-3s are really important for our mental health and our cognitive health. They can reduce depression and anxiety, reduce symptoms of ADHD, improve mental disorders, and reduce mental decline. Omega-3s also have a very important role in cardiometabolic health to decrease risk of heart disease and reduce symptoms of metabolic syndrome and other things like autoimmune diseases, improving sleep, and fight inflammation. So it's important to note that pre-contact traditional Cherokee foods were very high in these nutrients and micronutrients. For example, sunshine, being outside, is very important in getting enough vitamin D, mushrooms, wild bird eggs, foods like corn, beans, and squash, nuts, seeds, wild meats provide what we need as far as vitamin B, magnesium, and omega-3. The other thing I wanted to share with you all is that, again, plants give us gifts when we need them at very important times. So thinking about traditional Cherokee foods or foods that are in this region that Cherokees live now, in the fall and the winter is a time that we are more likely to get sick, to get colds, for example. And there's a list here of traditional Cherokee foods that are high in vitamins A, B, and C. Rose and rose hips, the very last one, are incredibly high in vitamin C, for example. Moving in the seasons to spring, particularly early spring, foods that are high in vitamin D and K, those mushrooms, eggs, and ramps. And after a long winter, it's important that we sort of replenish. And these are the foods that do that. And then we kind of move to late spring and early summer. This is a time that we need energy again during the winter months when we don't have access to as many fresh foods. And we need to prepare for things that we do in the summer that require a lot of energy. So saponins help our body absorb nutrients and especially minerals and get us going again. And foods that are high in saponin and other minerals listed here are poke for poke salad, kochani, burdock root, chickweed, wild mustard, garlic, and stinging nettle. And then we move a little bit more into summer. And in summer, temperatures go up. And so when things are hot, when we are sweaty, that's a place where bacteria can breed. And foods that have bioflavonoids are some of these flowers and berries listed here. Again, coming to us right when we need them with the antibacterial properties. So I just wanted to share some research that is out there about traditional indigenous foods and how they compare to contemporary foods. One example here is fiber. If you can see on the left, I know it's kind of small writing here, but the left in red are the traditional Native American foods. And what's next to them in blue to the right are the contemporary foods. So just if we look at the first two, for example, the cattail shoots and choke cherries compared to contemporary foods, asparagus and gooseberries, are much higher in fiber. And you can sort of see that trend through most of the other traditional foods. Also, if we look at macro elements, and we can see there are magnesium that we've talked about a little bit. In general, the pattern you can see here is that the traditional foods on the left fare better than the contemporary foods on our right. They're just not as nutritious. Another study looked at traditional indigenous foods and compared them to the contemporary foods. And I did just a little image here that has corn and beans, but it goes through quite a few others. And what this study really looked at is antioxidants. And the study authors said here that traditional plant-based foods of Native Americans with their rich source of natural phenolic antioxidants can be incorporated in dietary intervention strategies to counter chronic oxidative stress and other metabolic dysfunctions commonly associated with type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So that's pretty impressive. Also, previous and current in vitro studies with our three sisters crops, corn, beans, and squash, have found strong phenolic-linked antioxidant, anti-diabetic, and anti-hypertensive, which is blood pressure, properties of these traditional food plants. Just more evidence showing how powerful our traditional indigenous foods are. I wanted to share a little bit more research about traditional food projects. And so in these three examples, each of these projects, participants were asked to eat pre-colonial traditional indigenous foods of their region. And the results of these studies were really impressive. You can see the outcome in the bottom. So significantly reduced blood pressure, weight, body mass index, waist to hip ratio, body circumference, waist circumference, hemoglobin A1C, and MRI detected hepatic fat fraction. So some pretty impressive results with diets, these diet studies in which participants ate traditional indigenous foods. And here are those same studies again. In the top right, there's now a cookbook, Decolonizing Diet Project cookbook. So this is food from the Great Lakes region, primarily Anishinaabe. But if you look at these links here, they actually have what they call a grocery list, and they have just a really neat blog. In the top left, I wanted to share, this was a figure from the article that really stood out to me for a few reasons. You can see that they use their traditional indigenous language, and they did groups sort of community groups that met to talk about this project and how they wanted to make changes and how they wanted to intervene with traditional foods. And what's so interesting to me is these discussions of traditional foods really led to other things. Again, the use of traditional indigenous language, you can see, um, maybe you can see um, other things that it poured into: respect for others, sharing and helping others, looking to elders for guidance, adding culture in all aspects of tribal government, restoring the traditional chief systems. So just really impressive how thinking about revitalizing traditional food systems can be to revitalizing the entire society. And at the bottom is the traditional Haudenosaunee diet. And you can also see um, the traditional indigenous language there. So they seem to be very tied together. So the results of one of those studies I wanted to share with you. So the Healthy Roots was a study that was developed in the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory by Haudenosaunee community members. And this was a 90-day challenge. And what was really neat about this is that participants were provided a list of traditional foods from which they could eat, and they fell into 5 categories. Um, Foods from the woods, like venison, walnut, maple syrup. Foods from the water, like rainbow trout, walleye, or wild rice. Foods from the skies, like duck, turkey, and their eggs. Foods from the garden, white corn, kidney beans, and a variety of squash. And foods from the meadow, like blackberries, blueberries, honey, or Jerusalem artichoke. And to help the participants in the study, a basket containing a variety of these traditional foods was provided every 2 weeks. And participants were encouraged to only consume foods that were original to the lands on which the Haudenosaunee live, and to avoid processed foods, which they called the 5 white gifts: sugar, salt, lard, dairy, and wheat. So here are some of the results of this study. One is around chronic pain, baseline, which is before they started, pre-intervention, which is right before they started, and post-intervention, which would be at the end of those 90 days. And you could see chronic pain significantly reduced. Another thing that they measured was mental health. And some of these tests are from what they call the screener, the PHQ-9, which is a screener for depression. And to me, what's most impressive is in the middle that you see: in the last 3 months, were you sad, blue, or depressed for more than 2 weeks? And there's a control group who did not participate in the study and a purple group next to it. And the purple group was the Healthy Roots Intervention Food, and a traditional indigenous food group. Significantly, the percentage of participants that answered yes was significantly reduced. So significant improvement in mental health just by changing foods. So I know I went through a variety of topics, but I want to share some recommendations that I found in this article in particular. Said that here are some strategies to enhance traditional food plant diversity to counter the challenges of diet-linked chronic diseases. So it starts out in the top, thinking about our climate. Our environment is doing strange things, and we need to be sure to select Three Sisters crop that are climate resilient, and do some community gardening, they advise. The next is selecting native cultivars, or native or heirloom seeds and plants that have balanced nutritional profiles. So really looking at the nutrient content of what we have, our traditional plants, and making sure to grow them and to eat them. Then optimization of sustainable production practices and targeted communities. So in those Gadugi farms, we can't really grow corn crops or squash crops within a certain distance from one another. So communities would grow, some would grow Georgia candy roasters, and, several miles away, folks would grow Cushaw squash. And then those community planning meetings and councils would result in a way that we could share our foods and really be able to share the nutrients of all of those different Cherokee crops. So then down to the optimization of traditional food processing and preservation. I know Eastern Band, for example, has a place you can do canning, which is pretty neat. Then thinking about the synergies and integration of different traditional foods to improve health. Moving to traditional knowledge on preparation and preservation of foods, as we saw, these preparation methods are at risk of being lost. Then moving down to community-based food enterprise. Again, knowing that the majority of our foods come from foreign sources, and the resources that it takes for us to get here, to get those foods here. Also considering maternal and child health, thinking about breastfeeding and breastfeeding as first foods for our babies, and also thinking about what are traditional first foods for Cherokee children and babies. And also thinking about, largely systemic food and nutritional security solutions, kind of tribally, regionally, and nationally. And this study author said that a resilient native ecosystem with high species biodiversity, including plant-based food diversity, is essential for the sustainability and well-being of especially dislocated Native American communities. And with that, I'll leave you with one of my favorite Cherokee plants, coxog, elderberry. You can see the heart-shaped one in the middle. This plant lines all around our family's allotment land. You can see on the left, which is currently GMO corn. And on the right, one of the areas surrounding our allotment land that we don't have in our possession anymore is those elderberry plants, and teaching my son the importance of those plants. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop and say what no, and maybe we have some time for discussion and question. Well, hopefully y'all were able to stay with us as much as you could. This is a time we have a little over 10 minutes left just to have any discussion or any questions, or really however we want to use the rest of this time. I think you all have access to chat. So feel free to use that now. I will say, I recommend seeing Dr. Brett Riggs' presentations. Looks like he has 2 today. And I did see a little preview of one, so he'll be talking a little bit more about the Kadua Mound. Yeah, thank you all. Are there any Cherokee specific food projects? Well, there are several things happening. I wish I could let some other people unmute. Dr. Clint Carroll has a Cherokee Foods project that I know of. Dr. Courtney Lewis also has some food projects, webinars, and research. And if anyone knows of any others, please put them in a link. And Clint, if you're still here, could you put a link to your project? Thank you, Summer got it. Knowing the land. Someone asked about a good sources for native medications. That's kind of a challenging question. I'm not sure. I know I'm not the best person to answer that. It's hard because it's usually not a store. And I assume by native medications, you mean plant medicine. So most plant medicine are to be foraged, and there's lots of knowledge and protocol around those things. Actually, Clint, I really wish you could unmute now, but he has a great book that talks about the different levels of Cherokee medicine. And so that might be a good start to think about it more broadly. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question better. I don't think Cherokee plant medicine works like a store as far as convenience, unfortunately. Jenny Wilson says, if a community group was considering having a healthy dinner, what are some food or recipe suggestions you would have? What dough? Gosh, I should have more of my resources readily available. I believe the Cherokee Youth Council just published a Cherokee Foods cookbook. And so that might be a good resource. If anyone has it or can find it, feel free to put it in the chat. I really think, bean bread is one of my favorite go-tos. Really, there are not very many ingredients. Cornmeal and beans is pretty much all you need. So that's pretty healthy. Have a singer in the background here. Some other foods are, let's see, kanuji soup. That's one of my favorites. We have a ton of wonderful greens around here, like depending on the season, poke salad and kochani. Kochan is like a superfood. There's just a ton of, Cherokee foraged foods, as well as thinking about deer or different fish, crawfish. Someone mentioned, do you think the extreme allergic conditions of our people are caused by the lifestyles of modern life? Again, probably not a question that I am super qualified to answer. But I will say in some of the data that we looked at even today, you can see that with traditional food diets, there was a reduction in inflammation. Also, traditional foods didn't have things like the Haudenosaunee group called the 5 white gifts. So we know Indigenous people are, many of them have allergies to dairy and also wheat. So those are, post-colonial foods. What are your thoughts? You all have really good and really difficult questions. I wish we were sitting in a group and we could just discuss these. What are your thoughts on passing down traditions of healing foods such as medicine and the taboos some feel should be sacred and not shared? So I don't know the right answer. I ask Cherokee elders and probably bug them too much about Cherokee foods and plants. And I always ask them, is it okay if I share this information or not? And I try to respect that. And actually, I have almost never heard no. So I think it's about respecting our elders and respecting what they want to share or not. But also, I do push a little bit and ask a lot of questions just because I'm so interested. Another thing that we've done in some of the community centers are to bring speakers to different communities or community events or to NSU and tried to have the speakers be the folks that do the lessons. So things like doing a Kanaji presentation all in the Cherokee language, and then kind of supplement it with things like nutritional information about Kanaji and the history of maybe Canones and Kanaji. So that's a way that we can kind of been a good place to start, where people who have information that some of it they are comfortable feeling comfortable sharing it, and other information they're not comfortable, but having those people be the people leading the discussions. Celeste, our people seem to be born with allergies. Yeah, Celeste, I'm not sure what you're thinking, but there certainly is data that shows that Indigenous people are live and are born in areas with higher environmental degradation, and that does lead to increased allergies, health conditions like asthma, for example. So I do think you're onto something. And Summer put a link there into Indian ag sources to get tepary beans and some other indigenous foods from Native American producers. Thanks so much, Summer, for putting that in. That's great. So someone said, if we don't have access to traditional foods, what do you recommend for vitamin nutrients? That's a very good question. So wherever you're at in the world, there were indigenous people, and they've developed their foodways and lifeways specifically with that ecology. So, I would suggest thinking about wherever you're at, finding out what the traditional foods and plants are of that region. If you're in California or Arizona or Hawaii, learning about those traditional communities and really taking their lead on things like, not just the diets, but, how to support positive ecologies, how to address environmental degradation issues. But everywhere we are at, we have traditional foods. They might not be Cherokee foods, though. How do you use elderberry? So I like to do a few different things. I like to make an elderberry syrup, and I'm happy to share that if I can find a way to share it with this group, or if you want to contact me. And so the elderberry syrup has elderberry and echinacea, and it's really used for prevention and treatment of colds and flus. I also can make that into a tincture, and I also make that into gummies. Kudos to my niece Lily for finding out how fun it is to make plant medicine into gummies. People use it for teas as well. You can just dry the elderberry or the elderberry flower, and you can put it into teas. Some people eat elderberries. Other people say you shouldn't eat it raw. We have a couple minutes left, so I'll put my email into the chat. Thank you, Clint. This is a really beautiful video. I'll share what Clint said. A video that we did with the Cherokee Medicine Keepers that talks about a lot of the issues around conservation and access, and how we can bring back our land-based knowledge and ways of life. And so there is a YouTube link there. Thank you so much, Clint.
Are you not done?
Richard said, I'm thinking about water being as key to health, but how monoculture has to use pesticides and fertilizers that in turn affect health and the environment. I think you're right on track. Without healthy, clean waterways, then we certainly are in trouble with our plants and our foodways. And even the pesticides that we use at our own homes are problematic, let alone thinking about large agriculture. And definitely take a look at Clint's videos and some of the links that Summer put into the chat. And it was just great being with you all today. And maybe one day we can all be together and discuss this and some of the goals and what we all want to do around Cherokee foods and ecologies. And thank you for just letting me be here and share some of my thoughts with you all. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and Dodadago Ha'i.